as a public speaker, people are often surprised that I'm actually a little bit shy and a little bit socially awkward. But when I come into that public persona, I do try and inhabit it fully because we're trying to get the best possible value that we can out of any conversation.
Welcome to Better Conversations with me, Sehaam Cyrene, where we get to have a conversation about having better conversations. If you'd like to be a guest on my show, then drop me an email at betterconversations@papertuner.com and be sure to listen to the end for more information about being on the podcast. Security isn't funny, but it can be fun, and information security doesn't have to be hard, are the mantras of my guest today, Thom Langford, your virtual Chief Information Security Officer with a big, friendly but serious personality. Thom is always ready to engage. He does a combination of being serious in the same breath as pointing out truths and irony with humour and dry wit. Not an easy mix to pull off, and he admits that until people get to know him, occasionally some people don't get his brand of fun or might find it intimidating. As the former Chief Information Security Officer of Publicis Group, Thom was responsible for all aspects of information security risk and compliance, as well as managing the Groupe Information Security Programme. His conversation style is to listen deeply and then talk as he thinks, so a verbal processor. And he's very comfortable correcting his own words, a verbal version of typing a sentence, deleting back a few words, and then retyping something better, more accurate. What came through strongly in our conversation is how he's watched others manage people and what he's learnt about his own experiences managing people. Things like speaking truthfully and not shying away from giving bad news, while still being thoughtful, compassionate and supportive. He believes in the power of a face-to-face discussion and the eyeball-to-eyeball handshake to create credibility and trust, where an email is more likely to create distance and a bit of wiggle room for excuses about why work hasn't been delivered as agreed. When I asked him what's influenced his conversation style, it's his need for honesty. He talked about being a public speaker, how that's taught him to be more comfortable when receiving a compliment, not just because it's validating the other person's opinion, and it's the polite and gracious thing to do, but also because he sees it as a gateway for a more useful, in-depth exchange. It invites further conversation and connection. He believes that not only do experiences like this grow you, but they also generate respect from others towards you. So if you're a new manager, you might actually enjoy listening to Thom's counsel and his shared learnings as he's risen in seniority. When it comes to information security, he points out that it's a topic that's not always well understood. It's seen as a nice to have, an annoying part of the business that gets in the way of business. This view is changing slowly, so it's important that Thom can communicate the seriousness of security and have stakeholders view it as critical to the speed and resilience of their business. But that doesn't mean the conversation can't be fun. In talking about his best conversation and his worst conversation, Thom is a great storyteller. He speaks as things really are. He's not looking to blame. He just names things as they are and is willing to accept responsibility for his part in a disagreement. And he's very comfortable naming the feelings, the emotions, the states of mind as he takes us through work situations and significant conversations. Here he is. Hey Thom, lovely to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
So I want to jump in with your first question. So what does a better conversation look, sound and feel like to you?
I think a better conversation is one that is kind of obviously open and honest, but it's also one that is productive. In the sense that something comes out of it, even if it's something as small as a feeling or as big as an action or something like that. But I think a better conversation is where you've moved forward from where you are before. Now, that's not to say that casual conversations and conversations around the pub table have to have an end and a goal at the end of them per se, but certainly in the from the position of a business or a something where you are trying to achieve something, you need to have moved forward by the end of it.
Okay. So some sense of progress or some shift, whether it's an idea or getting someone on board or a connection.
That's right, and it could be as simple as someone feels better at the end of it. Feels better about themselves, feel better about their job, feels better about what they're doing, or better about someone else, or whatever. It doesn't matter. So, like I say, it doesn't have to be an actual tangible product. A feeling is just as good, but there has to be something at the end of it. Otherwise, you've just wasted 20 or 30 minutes. Now that thing at the end, that could be an improved relationship, of course. So you might be talking about not a lot in particular, but actually you've been able to engage with an individual and improve your standing with them, or improve your understanding of them, and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we tend to rush that or think that that piece isn't valuable, right? That time that we spend perhaps talking about not very much, seemingly, is actually really a critical part of connecting with people.
Yeah, absolutely. The relationship side of things is so important. The time that you spend talking to team members, either by the water cooler in the corridor, the time that you spend, when they uh, drop you a text even to tell you that something has been done, and then you go forward and engage just a little bit more with them about asking them how their day's going, what they're doing, if they're okay, etc. There is a benefit to that. There is an actual positive outcome that they might feel better and more appreciated at the end of it. As much as sitting down and having an hour long conversation about career goals or whatever. You could come out of an hour long phone call or a two or three direction text exchange, and you could have exactly the same amount of positive feeling at the end of it.
For sure. And so tell me, what's your perspective when there's friction in that conversation?
Yeah, friction. It's always difficult, and the natural thing is to try and shy away from it. And I think, like many people, I think there are a few people out there. They're in the minority of people who have thick enough skin that they actually don't care. But that kind of tells me something else about them as well, maybe. But I think friction is a difficult one, but it can be a very, very positive experience still, because if you try and shy away from bad news, if you try and sort of coach it in different in sort of the silver linings, the couching it in terms of look on the bright side, all that sort of stuff, people will see through that straight away. And I've seen this a lot, especially during things like performance reviews, for instance, when somebody doesn't get the pay rise they want, they don't get the promotion, they don't get the recognition they think they deserve. I think if you shy away from that conversation in any way, shape, or form, what you're doing is storing up problems for later on, because you are maintaining or even raising their expectations of what's coming. Now, most people, again, can actually, take bad news fairly well. Of course, they'll react emotionally initially, but I think if you recognize that actually that is just an initial sort of knee jerk response, and let that emotion come out, you can then sort of come in and talk, underneath that emotion a little bit more, and lay out the logic, the next steps, the support you think you can provide them, and even letting them know that failure is not always a negative thing. It can be it can, in the sort of medium to long term, can result in a lot of positive outcome. If you never fail, you've never really learnt. If you see what I mean. I sound like I'm reading from a book here, but the process of failure is actually really good for forming your opinions and your attitudes and how you operate, uh, as much as anything.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there's something about what you were saying, which is, to me, it sounded like a need to be honest and direct. And in that context, even if the news isn't great, people feel respected.
Yes.
And they can trust that what you're telling them is accurate. It's a clean and clear picture of what the situation is, and that's valuable to people. It's to know, where do I go from here? What's my status? What are my options? And when you're talking about that, that's what I hear.
I think that's exactly it. That's exactly it. Because I think, again, I mentioned about storing up problems for later. You're going to have to, eat your words later on, or you're going to have to say, well, I didn't mean it like that, or I was just trying to make you feel better, or whatever. And so therefore it's problematic. And I think that the respect that you gain by simply telling the truth, even if it's, I don't know why you didn't get the pay rise, why you didn't get the promotion, but I will find out. That's a positive thing. That's something that tells them that you're on their side. Ideally, you should know. Don't get me wrong, but that's not always the case. Companies are big and complex organisms and don't always behave in logical ways. But I think and even and if you do know and it's not great news, and even if you don't necessarily agree with it, you still need to tell them again. By virtue of them having all of the information, they can make a much more informed decision once the emotion has come, has subsided somewhat. A much more informed decision as to what they're going to do. From giving and this bad news, because of all those reasons, all those problems, it's going to sort of uncover. But always be there for that person. If it's that sort of managerial, supervisorial a role, for instance, always be there to offer advice and support. That person, certainly in a professional instance, is going to be, in the case of bad news, feeling, potentially lost, not know where to go, not know what to do, etc. And if you can be on hand to offer that kind of support in the face of bad news, I think again your messaging is going to sound that much more sincere as a result.
Completely. So let's switch tack a little bit here. I'm curious as to in what ways your work depends on having good conversations. So who are the people you talk to every day?
So it's interesting because I don't think it differs hugely from one industry to the next. Anybody from a sort of a leadership or senior leadership position, in that, yes, you talk to the people in your team, you talk to the people who are actually executing your vision or executing your work, through to their managers and your peers, and then upwards as well. And I think certainly I find in my industry, in information security, that the topic is not one that's often well received. It's seen as an overhead. It's seen as a gatekeeper to activities. We're often described as the business prevention unit, i.e., the part of the business that just says no to everything, when actually it couldn't be further from the truth. A good modern or contemporary information security unit actually encourages the business to run faster rather than slow down and stop. But there's a bunch of caveats to that, of course. Run faster, but keep us involved all the way, etc. And I think whilst our industry is changing along those lines, the actual perception of it is not. And so the conversations that we need to be having as a result are, I'd say, fundamental in nature, and really important to how we are going to operate in the future. We have to take people back to the basics, pare away at their understanding of who we are and what we do, strip that away, and then rebuild that impression of us and that understanding of what we do, and that can take months, that can take years in some cases. Uh,
Yeah,
it,
I was going to say that sounds like quite a slow process where
yeah,
you're building the blocks of understanding, you're educating people as you go and making sure that you're bringing people with you at each step.
exactly, exactly. I mean, it's extraordinarily rare that I can come out of a conversation with somebody who's got, the old view of us, and them leave and leave them thinking of us in entirely new lights. They will have had years of experiences and years of misinformation and even sort of bad interactions with predecessors, etc., that will completely inform their opinion. And so part of that is that, one, making very clear about who you are and what you do, etc., and then two, making sure you follow up on that, making sure you are actually doing what you say you're going to do. And that I think, again, going back to the basics of a conversation, is if you're going to commit to something in conversation, in a meeting, verbally or face to face verbally as well, you damn well better follow up on it too, because actually, in some ways, that verbal contract is even more binding than what you might have written in an email. I think, if you have a face to face meeting, when you look that person in the eye, you shake their hand to say hello and you shake their hand to say goodbye at the end of the conversation. That's a lot more immediate and personal than just an email that says, yeah, we'll get right on it. Because another email would then say, oh, but we're really busy now, we're going to have to change the schedule. And it seems it's much more difficult to say that in person. Um, no, I take that back. It's not more difficult to say it in person. It's more difficult for it to be believed in person. It comes across as far more insincere. And so I think that's the power of a conversation, is a double edged sword. The power of that face to face discussion, and that verbalizing, and to the eye contact.
Do you think that speaks into a person's credibility, the fact that it's an eyeball to eyeball exchange? You make that statement of, I will deliver on that. Do you think that becomes more binding because the individual's got more riding on it, that they've got credibility and reputation at stake in a way that's very personal, in a way that an email is not?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think, again, the email is well, we all know, is that very impersonal format anyway. But I think if we go back to even the origins of the handshake, is apparently, I'm no historian here, but is to sort of show, unarmed, etc., open-handed, trusting, etc. It feels so much more binding than something that's just sort of electronically flashed across the internet to somebody. And yes, that personal credibility and that personal commitment. I'm not just committing to some pixels on a screen and someone who might read them, or potentially might even not read them. To be honest with you, let's face it. Versus, I remember when I shook that person's hand. I remember how that made me feel. Emails, I guess, especially well written emails, are, memorable in many senses, but the actual evocation of a visceral response is very rare. Has to be some very passionate writing. Whereas, that yeah, writing, which we won't go into right now, but it has to be very, very very powerful stuff, versus just meeting someone, shaking their hands, talking to them about what it is, you're going to do, or whatever, and then shaking that hand again. That physical contact that evokes, or that produces, a chemical change in your body, and makes that meeting far more memorable as a result.
So, what's influenced or shaped your perspective on conversations, Tom?
I think um, I think honesty has influenced it. I've had some good bosses in the past, and they've always not sort of shied away from telling me both the good and the bad. Um, One of the things I did learn about sort of 10 years ago or so was being on the receiving end of things. And actually, for instance, being on the receiving end of a compliment. Most people, and not just the British people, but most people actually shy away from receiving a compliment. They say, "Oh, it was nothing. Oh, I was just doing my job, etc." When actually, that really diminishes what the other person is trying to say to you, and that you should actually be far more open to listening to what they're saying to you, i.e., thank you very much, and responding accordingly. By downplaying, what your part in it, or downplaying what they've said, you're actually downplaying what they're trying to say to you, and sort of diminishing their feelings and what they've tried to say. So it's I won't say insulting, but it disencourages them from doing that, something like that again. So I think, and being it's some it can feel very awkward in some circumstances to respond in certain ways. So again, a compliment, I don't want to say, "Why, thank you very much. Yes, I think I did do a fantastic job there." Blah blah blah. And I'm obviously over egging it a little bit, but actually, trying to actually engage in that kind of vein is really useful. It actually encourages the conversation to proceed in a far more um, constructive manner, because maybe they'd want to follow up with a little bit of constructive feedback about what could have gone better. But you've said, "Oh well, it was nothing. I just rushed it through, and I didn't really do it. It wasn't my I didn't do all the work anyway," and blah 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 blah. And that then puts them on the back foot as regards, well, I can't really talk about what I think that could have gone better then if you don't feel you did anything with it. So you're actually cutting off a potential source of feedback and um, uh, possibility for improvement anyway, or even just some follow up conversations.
I thought it was interesting what you said there about it being awkward to receive a compliment, because we don't hear enough instances, I think, of someone receiving a compliment and handling it well. And also your point about potentially it's disrespectful to dismiss a compliment so quickly, as well as cutting off from that feedback that might be useful. So I think it's important that we do, when we receive a compliment, that we model how best to respond to that compliment so that it becomes more normal, and it allows for people to see what could continue on from that. There's more information to come out of that.
That's right, absolutely. And I think what helped me with that was public speaking, and a lot of people coming up to me afterwards, either in person or email or LinkedIn afterwards, and saying, "Thank you very much for that. I found that really helpful. I found that that was really interesting, whatever." And I used to initially kind of almost backed that away, but now it's more a case of saying, "Well, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it and you got something from it," and that then prompts the next part of the conversation, which I think is important. Rather than saying, "Oh, well, I just got up there and did the talking," what don't blah blah blah. It can really chop them down at the knees before they've even started. There they are trying to be blunt, to be nice to you, to make you feel good. And actually, the more you embrace it, I think the well, the healthier you become, at the risk of then becoming a massive ego pain in the backside to somebody. But hopefully we all know people who are going to sort of bring us down to earth. I certainly know a few, but but I think it's healthy for you to understand and appreciate when you have done a good job.
Tell me, what's the best conversation you've ever had?
The best conversation I've had, I'm going to have
You want me to remind you?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
So you said, I disagree with a team member many years ago.
Oh, right. Yeah, I did think that, and I thought, well, was that the right one? Yes, absolutely. That was one of the best conversations I had because ultimately it was so positive. But yeah, many years ago, must have been 8 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. I was having a very how can I put it? A very vigorous conversation with a team colleague about something. Actually, he was somebody who reported into me, but I've never been one for sort of pulling rank on people, and never been one for telling them to, I've never really pulled a veto on people before. So, having people talk openly and honestly to me is really important. So we were having a very vigorous and heated conversation, and it escalated. To be honest with you, it started to get a little bit personal, nothing too dangerous, but it started to get a little bit personal. I pulled out a few choice swear words here and there, and I think maybe one of us hung up on the other, or maybe we were disconnected, or maybe we just were silent and said we're going. I don't recall, but it was a not a great end to the phone call at all, and we'd both put our points across to each other very, how can I put it, very poorly and very vehemently. But it was very clear that we were both extremely passionate about this particular topic and that it mattered to us personally, really intensely, you could almost say. And I think it was the next day, and I set up a meeting with the individual, and we started the meeting, and immediately the tones of our voice was entirely different. We'd obviously had a time to think about it. We'd both, actually realized that the other person was not doing this deliberately, to us. We weren't disagreeing with them. I was not disagreeing with him just to disagree with him. I felt that there was something fundamentally different at play, and he went through exactly the same process. And we picked apart the conversation slightly, and actually realised that bottom line was we're just extremely passionate about this, and that we feel that there are certain ways of achieving things and certain ways that things needed to be done, etc. And we came to a very, well, to be blunt, a very happy compromise. In fact, it was probably the best solution anyway, because it wasn't as extreme as one or other of the views that we held. And so I think, and what that actually meant was, I've never argued with that person since, and I continued to work with him up until just a few months ago. I've never argued with that person since, and it actually changed and evolved the way that we discussed things. We almost came to, I'd say we almost came to blows. That's not correct at all. We had another very intense conversation not that long ago, and we weren't afraid of really talking about how we were feeling during that conversation, but we were able to accept it and acknowledge it far more easily than we ever could have before. And so it became, if not the best outcome at the end, because the decision was made, if you see what I mean, but we understood far more about, we appreciated far more where the other person was coming from. So that first experience allowed us to shortcut a lot of BS that many conversations are littered with, with many other people as a result.
That's true. You've got history, you've worked together for a long time, and you've got a lot
Yeah.
of common ground. And that does allow you to shortcut. And potentially that argument that you had in the past paved the way for a much quicker way
Yeah.
to get to a resolution in the more recent conversation.
Precisely, and we still reference it now. To be honest with you, we still talk about, when we're talking about disagreements, or things like that. We will, if we're in the same room together, we'll kind of glance at each other and raised eyebrows, and we know exactly what we're thinking of. So it wasn't just memorable for me; it was certainly memorable. It was certainly memorable for him as well.
So that's a conversation that started off not so great, and ended up being fantastic, and gave you a platform for future conversations with each other. So what would a really bad conversation, what's the worst conversation you've ever had?
I think the worst conversation I've had, and also the worst type of conversation you could have, is the one that you go in expecting to have one kind of conversation, a positive one, and it comes out as a very negative one. So I went into a conversation with a member of my team to give him a pay rise and a promotion. The promotion was deserved. The pay rise was not wonderful, but it was above the average for the company. And I went in completely laissez-faire, to be honest with you. I went in there, very much thinking, this is going to be a fun, lots of laughs, and we'll go out for a beer afterwards and all that sort of thing. And it was awful. This person was upset. He felt that he should almost have had a double promotion and a significant pay rise. He didn't acknowledge the fact that he was, many percentage points above everybody else who had promotions. Didn't acknowledge anything at all, and my initial thought was, this can't be right. How is somebody behaving like this? He was, I wouldn't say he wasn't exactly throwing chairs around, but he was certainly prowling around the room like a caged animal. And so by the end of it, I I just committed to him that I would try and do something about it. Managed to get him an extra couple of percentage points, which he sort of basically just grunted his thanks. I should be more anyway, but thank you. And then 6 months later, he left anyway. So it's kind of like, it was terrible on so many levels. One, because I expected it to be better. Then I thought it just felt like he was, just a bit of almost pretend indignation. He thought he could get a little bit more. And my gut feel was, this doesn't feel right. And I should have stuck with my gut feel, because it wasn't right. He was obviously, trading us off against, other possibilities, etc. Other career possibilities, and so it just left a very bad taste in my mouth. And I think what should have been a positive conversation with perhaps, actually, I'm still, I'm not satisfied. Thank you for this. Thank you. This is good news for me, but it came across much more personally and much more aggressively than it should have.
And what I find interesting about that, Tom, is how it echoes what you were saying at the beginning about friction. If you've got friction in the conversation, it ends up being the focus. And it sounds like that was a perfect case of, the conversation became about the friction.
Yes.
And less about, you've got a pay rise and you've got a promotion, and what can you do to keep going in that direction? And that was the opportunity that was potentially missed. Is that what I've heard?
Yeah. I mean, like this again. This was about this was about 12 years ago. I think I was a little bit more naive then, and a little bit more sort of trusting of where people came from, and I think I could, I could and should have, handled it a lot better and actually managed those expectations down. But my gut feel, or my sorry, not my gut feel, my initial response was to try and deal with the escalation by immediately empathizing and saying, I'll see what I can do, rather than actually delivering some bad news, which is, mate, this is it. And frankly, I think you're getting exactly what you deserve, etc. So I wasn't. In fact, there you go. It's almost like I'm joining up the dots. There you go. I wasn't willing to have that. Um, I'll rephrase that. I flinched from giving the bad news. Um, and the bad news for this person was, this is it. And so I think, and that again is probably one of the influences on me, one of the sort of seminal conversations, seminal moments that I had around, what actually changed or helped form my communications and conversation approach.
What else are you good at in conversations? What do people enjoy about having a conversation with you?
I like to have a laugh, to be honest with you. I like to, I like to enjoy myself. I have a saying about information security that it's not funny, but it doesn't mean it can't be fun. And I think that applies to, business and, many other things. You've got to have fun. There's far too much bad news and seriousness and just the world can sometimes be a pretty bleak place, and I'm not just talking politically or ecologically or socially, but just the workplace can be a pretty dull and grey place at times. And I think and I learned this a long time ago from some old bosses of mine who I just used to laugh out loud on a daily basis with them, because we would joke around, and as a result of that, I really enjoyed my time working with them. Um, they had many other great characteristics. Don't get me wrong, but and I think that's rubbed off on me in that there's no reason I don't think that we can that we have to be so serious about everything all the time. It does mean I can have a pretty dark sense of humor at times, potentially not politically correct, etc. Which can be dangerous, but I think it's I would nothing I've ever laughed or joked about has ever been personal or insensitive as such. But I think having that kind of sense of fun really does make a difference. I think, I always say that when I do interviews over the phone, I ask two things. One is paint me a picture of who you are, and the second thing I do is always crack some kind of joke, because their response will tell me a lot about that person. you know, whether they're gonna they don't understand the joke and laugh anyway, or in which case they're sycophantic, or they don't understand the joke and will ask it for it to be explained, or they get it and just roar uproariously and with laughter. All of that tells me something about that person. For good and bad, mostly good, I'm glad to say, but that sense of humor is what is important, I think.
I have a similar sort of thought process, which is that what you do tells me a lot about you, and what you don't do equally tells me something about you. And that speaks into body language. Sometimes, we may be saying one thing and our body is saying something completely different.
Yes.
How do you take in body language? Are you aware of it?
Yes, I think so. I mean, aside from, like most teenagers buying a book on body language, thinking it's a great way to meet girls. And aside from that, very early experience of body language, I've not studied it per se, But I think there's some very, very, obvious stuff, right? If the other person is checking their phone or still typing away on their laptop or is, gazing out a window or whatever, then I think, it's very obvious. But also think you can use body language yourself to really set the tone of the room. So I remember a boss who used to lean his chair right back and then put his feet on the table when he had a meeting with people in his office. And it sounds really obnoxious, but what he was showing was this is a relaxed place that you can speak your mind. And we did as a result, and I have emulated that to a certain point. Um, I wouldn't say to a to to a T per se, but that kind of relaxed posture and easygoing body language, I think, is really important in, like I say, establishing the tone of the room. It's different when it's not your office, when it's not your meeting or whatever, but you can still really you can heavily influence how a meeting is going to go by body language and humor. You can break the ice very quickly. I was once told that I was walking into a meeting with somebody I'd never met before, and she said to me, um, "You you've been smiling ever since we met until we've sat down. It's very rare that I see that. Normally people's faces just switch off, but you've been smiling all the way here, and it's very disarming." And I think that's true. When you smile, you're trying to put the other person at ease. You're trying to actually show that you know this is a place of trust and openness.
Does anyone ever misunderstand you?
Oh, all the time, I'm sure. Um, and in fact, some people. Uh, Actually, I'll just answer that straight. Yes, absolutely. I've still continued in the same vein. I would say 99% of the time, because I think it's very contextual. Sometimes they might be distracted. They might be from a different culture, for instance, a different country, etc. So yes, there are times when it is misunderstood and they think I'm not taking something seriously. But as they get to know me better, they understand that actually I take it very seriously. I just happen to smile and joke about a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, and when I meet you in person, your energy comes across really strong in that you do want to enjoy the conversation, you want to enjoy what's coming next. And there's an openness about you in terms of where this conversation might go and flexing to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. In the same way that your smile can be disarming, when we're slightly extroverted and have a lot of energy, it can also be intimidating.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But again, I think, and you're right, because we were talking, just before we kicked off the recording about, as a public speaker, people are often surprised that I'm actually a little bit shy and a little bit socially awkward. But when I come into that public persona, I do try and inhabit it fully, because we're trying to get the best possible value that we can out of any conversation. And I don't mean that in a very, cold way. I mean that in a, we need to do something. We want to get something out of this, even if it's just to make myself feel good. But yeah, I think that energy can be off-putting. But then I also like to think that as time goes by and as those interactions continue, and they continue at that same level of energy and happiness in inverted commas and openness, etc., that people will come to realize that it is genuine. It's not a tactic, if you see what I mean. I admit, I think possibly, 10, 15, even 20 years ago, it may well have been a tactic because I didn't know what else to do, laugh or cry. And I didn't particularly want to cry in my first, big meeting. So I thought I'd laugh. Um, so, so it probably was a tactic, but now it's actually who I am and the way that I get the most out of a meeting and the most out of interactions with people.
Do you think that's about consistency now that it's a habit and you're comfortable in being that way? Do you think that's about consistency and what people experience of you repeatedly that tells them it's genuine?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and in fairness to me as well, I couldn't imagine doing it any other way. Um, I do sometimes have to resist the urge to tell a joke during bad news, but but sometimes it works. To be honest with you, it breaks that tension. There's that surface tension bubble almost of tension, uh, and it needs to be broken. So that people can sort of let out that breath and, okay, yeah, we're still alive. Nobody died. So it can work.
Yeah, yeah. The element of joking in a meeting, I think, is quite tough, though, for a lot of us because, will it land right? Will I be taken seriously after I've told the joke? Will I annoy someone that I'm trying to impress or who's important in, moving something forward? So you have the comfort with being able to tell a joke and turn something quite serious funny. How much of that is who Thom is and your outlook on life?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And in fact, it reminds me of a story that a close friend of mine told me. Somebody from his rugby club died. And this person was known for not buying a drink, buying a round. Basically, he was the cheapskate, but very much loved and liked. And he died in his sort of early 40s or something. Not very very unhappy, very sad, etc. And six of his friends were charged with carrying the coffin into the church. And it was a very upsetting and sad moment of time. And as they were walking up, they had to go up a couple of steps into the church in a slight incline, and apparently the body shifted in the coffin a little bit. At which point, one of the guys carrying the coffin said, "It's a bit late to be reaching into your pocket now, Gary." Which of course set everybody off and actually broke the tension, and actually people started to, I wouldn't say enjoy the funeral, but actually see it more as the celebration of life that it should have been, rather than just the the absolute sadness of death. So I think humor works universally, where when many other approaches don't.
Yeah, clearly, they were very quick-witted to
Well, yeah.
to do that, and it was a shared experience of that person.
Well, exactly, because everybody knew what he was like, so
Right, yeah. Is there anything else that you want to mention that we haven't touched on, Thom?
I don't think so. I think covering just even the basics, I think for me is honesty, humour, and probably a third thing that begins with H as well will be my three takeaways.
Good. Well, let me know when you figure out what that third H is.
Yeah, absolutely. Humility. Hubris. No, not hubris. That's the wrong one. That's the opposite of humility, isn't it? Humility, that'll do.
Humility's good. Humility's good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Thom, very much. It's been fantastic. I've enjoyed hearing your stories.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Better Conversations with me, Sehaam Cyrene. You'll find show notes for today's episode at papertuner.com/podcast, including more information about my guest, Thom Langford. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please do. You'll find Better Conversations with Sehaam Cyrene on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And don't forget to show your enjoyment with a full star rating, please. Better Conversations is a podcast series about having better conversations, mostly at work, but elsewhere too in our lives. I'm wanting to capture and explore what regular heroes like you from all walks of life enjoy about conversation. We get to indulge in acknowledging what you're good at and equally admitting what you are rubbish at, who winds you up and who has inspired or influenced how you like to have conversations. There's no judgment here, it's just an interlude of reflection about the finer aspects of conversations as it stands for each of us. If you've got questions or suggestions or you'd like to appear as a guest, drop me a line at betterconversations@papertuner.com with a convincing, entertaining, or just a down-to-earth opinion that you have about the importance of conversation. I'm Sehaam Cyrene, and this has been A Better Conversation. Bye for now.